Diamond, Diamond.
A precious gem of the most valuable kind. When pure, it is clear.
Diamond, Diamond.
A family name bringing traditions of love, hard work, and moral values.
This is the Diamond Education Podcast with my mom and dad, Jon and Kellee, England.
Welcome to the Diamond Education Podcast with Jon and Kellee, England, your hosts. We're here to help you find the most valuable education for your child.
Kerry McDonald is the Senior Education Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE, and the host of the LiberatED podcast and the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside of the Conventional Classroom. Kerry's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, Education Policy Fellow at the State Policy Network, and a regular Forbes contributor. Kerry has a bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College in economics and a master's degree in education policy from Harvard. Kerry has researched homeschooling, public schooling, alternatives, self-directed learning, education entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and family and child policy. Her articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, Washington Examiner, City Journal, Entrepreneur, and the Journal of School Choice, among others. Kerry lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her husband and 4 children. Kerry, welcome to the Diamond Education Podcast.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Jon and Kellee. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, excited to have you, Kerry. So thank you for coming. So we're going to jump right in, Kerry, and ask you, what is education?
Yes, what a great, bold question. I would say that education is really the process of passing on knowledge, information, skills, and tools to the rising generation and empowering individuals to reach their full potential.
Yeah, and I love that because I recently read your book, Unschooled, and I wonder, what inspired you to, I know you're an unschooler, and that, again, you wrote your book. So what inspired you to write your book about unschooling and to unschool your own children?
Yeah, a great question. When we think about, sort of the definition that I just shared of education and passing on these kind of this knowledge and tools and cultural information to the rising generation so that they can achieve their fullest potential, it's really recognizing that education is separate and distinct from what we would think of as conventional schooling. So that was sort of the main driver for writing the Unschooled book, is acknowledging this difference between education and schooling, that education is something we humans naturally do. We are, sort of primed to pass on information to that rising generation. And that we can do that potentially even more effectively outside of conventional systems of schooling, particularly when we allow young people's interests and passions to kind of guide that learning. And that's really the essence of unschooling and self-directed education more broadly. So my Unschooled book looks at various forms of self-directed education. I use self-directed education and unschooling interchangeably. This could be a method of homeschooling in which there's sort of maximum freedom and autonomy for learners, and parents or adults in that homeschooling environment would be connecting young people to various community resources and digital resources that are aligned with their interests and passions to kind of facilitate that learning. But it can also happen, unschooling and self-directed education can also happen in microschool environments and self-directed learning centers that I profiled throughout the Unschooled book. And this was a time, the Unschooled book came out in the spring of 2019. And I documented sort of the beginnings of the rising microschool movement as it related to self-directed education and unschooling centers. And of course, over the past couple of years, we've seen microschooling become now very trendy, and everyone's sort of interested in microschooling, which are these intentionally small, typically mixed age learning environments with a highly personalized curriculum, or in the case of self-directed learning centers, a specific educational philosophy and approach that's kind of tailored in that environment. And so, we're seeing kind of that growth in microschooling. But in my book, I really traveled the country looking at self-directed microschools specifically and how they were helping to facilitate this kind of unschooling philosophy and help young people to take charge of their own education and really set their own path based on their interests and passions.
Oh, I love that, Kerry. So I don't know a lot about it. Like we mentioned, we are new to the like homeschooling, microschooling world. And so Jon was telling me about unschooling, and you and Jon have worked together on a lot of things and know each other pretty well. And so this unschooling is a new concept for me. And as coming from the conventional system, public education system, where it is very structured, unschooling is a little scary in my mind, and I don't know if you faced that when you were researching or starting with your kids, or I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is it's a new concept to me, and it's kind of like, I guess I fully don't understand it. So
what is the practical, what does it look like practically, I guess, in the day-to-day in life of a mom with their kids, who are typically the ones who are doing this, right? And so, or a dad.
Yeah, so I can maybe share, like, my sort of personal journey there that might be helpful. So I became interested in alternative education and homeschooling and education policy as an undergraduate and then in graduate school, and always thought about homeschooling my future children. And then when I had my kids, it became very clear that homeschooling was going to be the right path for our family. That we live in the city in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we have all of these resources that are outside of our door, libraries and museums and cultural events and historic sites. And so it seemed like in their early days, certainly, that if we were to put our children in school, that their world would contract, that they would sort of be in the same building every day with the same standardized curriculum and the same age segregated group of students and static handful of teachers. And yet, through their early learning, they were really immersed in their community doing all kinds of really interesting things. And so that was sort of, I think, our first recognition that homeschooling provided that freedom and flexibility and autonomy that they just wouldn't get in a conventional school environment. But even when we started committing to homeschooling, my husband and I, when our oldest, who's now 16, was a preschooler, we still thought, I think, that we would pursue kind of a traditional homeschooling path. And I remember as my oldest daughter, Molly, was moving toward kindergarten age, I felt the pressure to start really looking at a traditional curriculum for her for homeschooling. And so even though we had kind of a very play-based approach to learning in her early years, and again, that kind of immersion in the people, places, and things around us, I felt like, okay, now that she's almost 5, we have to get serious about a specific curriculum or specific strategy for teaching the 3 R's. And so as I was researching homeschooling curriculum and still wanted it to be, fun and engaging and child-centered, there were still, clear expectations and assessment tools to use to make sure that she would learn these things that I expected her to learn in kindergarten. And as I was researching and kind of finalizing what my curriculum choices would be, out of nowhere, she taught herself to read.
Oh, wow.
And then that made me think, wow, okay, so I'm about to spend all of this money on a homeschool curriculum to teach my daughter how to read, which is something she's already doing. And then that made me pause and recognize kind of all of these other things that she was learning organically, spontaneously through this kind of natural process of learning and pursuing her interests and that those sort of drives for discovery and exploration that all young children exhibit. So then I started looking into, is there such a thing as non-curriculum homeschooling? Or, I don't exactly remember the search terms I would have used at the time, but, was there a different approach to homeschooling that was much more focused on facilitating the natural learning that children would already be doing without imposing a top-down curriculum? In essence, not bringing school at home, but looking at education as much, much more broad than just schooling. And that was when I discovered this whole idea of unschooling and self-directed education. Peter Gray, who is a Boston College psychology professor, has long done research in self-directed education and unschooling. He wrote a book called Free to Learn. And that was something that I started to really think about through his work and his blog at Psychology Today. That opened up kind of another world for me too. And then I discovered the work of John Holt, who was a well-known author and educator back in the 1960s, who wrote the best-selling books, How Children Fail and How Children Learn. And he coined the term unschooling in 1977 to mean learning taking place outside of a schooling environment. So that was sort of an interesting path. And then from there, it just made sense to kind of continue to facilitate children's learning, recognizing that they have this capacity and passion for exploration and discovery in early childhood. And that doesn't just go away when they hit school age. If we can continue to nurture that and facilitate that, they'll continue to be inquisitive and love to learn for years to come.
Yeah, I find that interesting because one of the things that I think a lot of maybe new parents to homeschooling will do is just try and make school look like it did, but just in their home. And so what would you say to a parent who is maybe worried about, hey, I need to make sure my kid is reading and that they're on level for math and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is over the past couple of decades, there's been a real push to ever younger ages for children to learn to read. I think of, for example, research by professors at the University of Virginia, who in 1998 asked teachers whether or not they thought that kindergartners should be reading. And only about 30% of teachers responded that they thought kindergartners should be reading. Fast forward 12 years after the passage of No Child Left Behind, kind of federal legislation that led to Common Core competencies and more standardized testing. By 2010, 80% of teachers said that children should be reading in kindergarten. And all that had changed really in that time were the expectations, the benchmarks for academic proficiency at younger ages. The children hadn't changed. But when we see that just in such a short period of time, now we're expecting 5-year-olds to learn to read, then if they're not reading, that's a problem within a standardized system that's driven by tests where teachers are accountable to that test, and they don't have a lot of freedom and flexibility to personalize education. And so that's where I think we see the rise of sort of labels for children of being reading delayed and potentially interventions there, when it could just be that the child isn't yet ready to read. And interestingly, in my book, I talk about research on natural reading, sort of the natural bell curve of reading and literacy development that would happen outside of a conventional classroom. Researchers in Europe have done some really great work on this. And they find that if we think of a bell curve of literacy, just like we do with all other kind of childhood developmental milestones, walking and talking and all kinds of things, there's a range. And they found that on the early end of the range, kids who would be early or precocious readers, as they would be known, would be 4 or 5-year-olds. And then on the later end could be even as high as sort of 10 or 11-year-olds. And the middle, sort of most children learning to read proficiently, meaning they could read almost anything, is about 8.5. But if you think about that, 8.5 in a standardized school system now that is expecting kindergartners to read is just way beyond anything that a teacher could accommodate and that the standardized setting could accommodate. And so I think that that's a real mismatch between where we as kind of humans would naturally develop these literacy skills when we're supported, when we're surrounded by literacy and encouraged to read and read to, but that will be around 8.5. And yet we're pushing those reading expectations to ever earlier ages. And it just could be that kids aren't ready.
Yeah, I agree. So that's really interesting, Kerry, because we have a 7-year-old. So he's considered first grade in the conventional system this year. And he was one of the ones I was most nervous about bringing home because I was like, I've never taught a kid really how to read before, right? But it's been interesting to watch because we brought him home halfway through kindergarten. And the other day we were in a church class and these little kids might be reading, faster right now, but our little boy is learning how to read and he's loving it.
Yes.
And it's like, but it's mom reading, some of the bigger, like he's into Frog and Toad right now and laughing at them. And, and I have to help him with a few words, but it was scary for me. But then I realized as I talked to more people and like you and all these that have seen the research that it's okay. He will get it by the time he needs to, and he's loving it, which is important,
That's the most important thing too, is just to retain that love of reading by enabling him to learn to read through reading things that matter to him and that he finds enjoyable. And I'll also add, another piece of interesting research from what we would call quote unquote late readers, which would be kids who are learning to read even after age 8.5, kind of on the other end of the reading bell curve. They would frequently go from sort of 0 to 60 really quickly, go from not being a proficient reader to all of a sudden being a highly proficient reader and reading Harry Potter. And that's usually the example that I'm given in all of these sort of anecdotes of these stories, is they'll start reading novels very quickly within a matter of a couple of months, and then kind of off to the races. And they've retained that love of reading. There are these stories over and over that parents, and I profile a lot of them in the book, of parents who specifically, would take their kids out of school because they saw that love of learning and love of reading being drained from them, or they had teachers and administrators wanting to put labels on their children. And the parents just sort of knew deep down, like, I don't think this is a child issue. I think this is a schooling issue. And sure enough, when they removed the child from that environment into a different kind of learning setting that's more relaxed, that's more personalized, where they can choose what they're learning, what they're reading, then the learning takes off. And again, that spark, that love of learning is continued to be nurtured.
Yeah, I love that, Kerry, because even relating that back to our first grader, he didn't, in kindergarten, he didn't like going. He wanted to be homeschooled because I was homeschooling the other kids. And they were learning whole word reading, right? And he'd bring home these books and he hated them, like, and now we're at Frog and Toad, and he brought I Survived. I don't know if you know the I Survived series, wanting me to read them to him, like, he's bringing out these type of books. And then I look at my third grader now, who is, like you saying, reading Harry Potter and Michael Vey and, all these books because they love it. And her vocabulary is well on its way and doing well. And then my boy, his reading maybe isn't as high right now, but like his math, he's taking off in. So it's that, I love that unschooling idea of they'll get there, like let them just go with what they're interested at
and
the
be
time.
Kids.
Yeah. And there's actually one story in the Unschooled book that I relay of a parent of a grown unschooler now whose one of her children was a very, very late reader. I don't think he started reading until he was 11. And she knew that if he was in a conventional system, that would be completely, wildly unacceptable. I mean, never allowed. But she really had this sense that he was working on other things. He had these other incredible talents, like you said, your son being, really talented in math. For this child, he was an incredible ballet dancer. He actually performed professionally later in early adulthood.
Wow.
He was, memorizing lines for plays and performances that he was doing. So he was just busy doing other things. And then he was one of those very late readers who then became a very proficient reader very quickly. And after his, kind of career with ballet dancing ended by, mid-20s, or, these often don't go on for years, he ended up going pre-med and pursuing a career in medicine. And the mom in the book said, I think that if he had been in a standard school setting and sort of forced to read before he was ready and probably labeled with some kind of reading delay, she thinks that he wouldn't have had the confidence later in life to pursue a career in something so academic as medicine. And so she really thinks it was that granting him that freedom to develop on his own timetable and really work on things when he was passionate about them that provided that opportunity.
No, I love that.
Yeah. And I think that actually leads into kind of the next topic I want to talk about, which is some of the myths about unschooling, which is that I think there is a misconception out there that if you're unschooling, it means you're not teaching your children at all, which as I read your book, I realized very quickly actually to unschool probably takes a lot more preparation on the parents' part because they have to be ready to teach the kid when they're ready. And so can you talk a little bit about some of those myths and what does, like, when a kid does when a kid is ready to read, like, I mean, I'm sure that there's phonics that gets taught at that time because, hey, I'm ready to read.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's such a good point, Jon. I mean, the idea with unschooling is that there is no adult imposed curriculum for children, but it doesn't mean that you wouldn't actually use curriculum or even choose a very kind of standard traditional path related to learning. With curriculum and with tests and with teachers. It just means that it's developed through the child's interests and critically that the child has the ability to quit, right? So it's providing that same level of respect to young people that we would expect as grown-ups, where if we decide that we're taking a class and we don't like it, we will leave. We won't waste our time. And it's sort of providing that same rite of exit to young people. And one of the examples that I use in the book and that I like to explain to sort of show how unschooling works is the example of my older daughter, who became really interested in martial arts. There was a new martial arts studio that opened in our neighborhood, and she became curious about that and took a practice lesson there and fell in love with it, and then decided to enroll in the school full time as a martial arts student. She now at 16 has her black belt. So it's been a passion for her. But in those beginning days of learning martial arts, she became really interested in Korean language and culture and history connected to her study of martial arts. And so she began reading more about, again, Korean culture and history, and then wanted to learn Korean language. So she started by using Duolingo, which is a free online language learning platform to learn Korean. And that was great for a while, but she wanted something more rigorous. And so I was able to connect her to additional resources. I sent out a message, a query, and a local community message board saying, does anybody, have a lead on a Korean language tutor? And there was a native South Korean speaker who happened to live in our city. And they would meet a couple of times a week doing a curriculum in Korean, and she would take tests. And there was homework and expectations around that, but she absolutely loved it, and knew that again that at any point she could stop doing that if she had another interest. Obviously with respect for the teacher and making sure there was notice and all of those kinds of courtesies. But yes, that ability to drive your own learning and find the resources that are meaningful to you. And that's where adults are so crucial with the unschooling model, is to connect children with those resources. And then again, being flexible if interests change.
Oh, I love that. So because we have a 16-year-old and she's been in the public school system till this year, she wanted to stay last year. And it's been tricky trying to find, get her mindset out of that public school system model and find interests. And so I love that example, Kerry, because it gives me ideas on, okay, she's not liking like language arts necessarily and writing papers, but how can I help her maybe write or discover those things, that brings the love of writing into it, or just things like that. So
yeah, and I talk about this in the book too. I mean, there might be a deschooling process that she needs to go through. We become conditioned to be taught, and I think even for those of us who are adults, I mean, I went to K-12 public schools. It took me time to recognize that maybe there's a different way of learning, and maybe I can shed some of my preconceived notions of what education is and what it could be. And certainly the longer that you're in the system, so a 16-year-old who's been in a conventional classroom for several years could take even longer to kind of re-engage with that natural curiosity and figure out what her interests are.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that's I love that idea as well. And just like the idea of being able to, again, choose when they begin and when they end, because that is how I learn right now as an adult. Like I maybe I need to do something around the house even, and I go to YouTube, or I find a manual, or I read an article on the website about, okay, how do I, fix my brakes on my car or whatever, like something like that, where I can get in there and actually do it on my own, it's the method that I use.
And it's not like, because a lot of people might see that, I don't know, Kerry, like lazy, right? Like if you don't, right, do it a certain way. But it's interesting, like with our 16-year-old, because she really loves nails and doing nails, And so she is taking off with that. She decided to go to a tech school,
Mm-hmm.
But in my mom mind, with coming from the public education system, it's like, well, she needs this, and this, where it's like, no, this child is still learning and loving, where it's that scary, I need to step back and
there's an e-schooling process, I think, for parents as well.
I think that's really true. And I think also, when we look at the standard system of schooling, it's really a conveyor belt model where there's a sort of, again, top-down expectation, arbitrary expectation of what you will do when, instead of this acknowledgement that learning is a lifelong process. And so maybe your daughter's really passionate about this topic right now. And she, as you point out, is learning quite a bit. And then she'll continue to learn and continue to develop proficiency in pursuit of her own goals.
Yeah. And I love that, not putting a stipulation that has to be nail tech the rest of her life either. Like she can change because she's interested in cosmetology, but also she's mentioned surgery because she loves anatomy and things like that. And it's interesting in society, Kerry, even because she mentioned, someone asked her what she wanted to be. And she's like, well, maybe I want to do nail tech cosmetology part-time and be a surgery tech part-time. And someone was like, I don't think you can do that, And we were like, yeah, she can.
Like, why not? Yeah.
Well, and it's also, I think, a recognition of the society in which we now live. Like, I mean, if someone had asked you both when you were 16, what do you want to be when you grow up? Absolutely. Would you have said you're going to be podcasting?
No.
Right? Like that didn't even exist.
No.
And so I think that's part of it too, that we don't even know with, innovation and technological progress, what some of the interesting career paths there will be, what opportunities will be around for us. And that's sort of one of the main points I make in the Unschooled book, is that in a society in which we are increasingly coexisting with robots, we have to think about what differentiates human intelligence from artificial intelligence. And it's these qualities of creativity, curiosity, an entrepreneurial spirit, ingenuity. Those are the real qualities that make humans human. And yet those are often the same qualities that are eroded through standard models of schooling, where, young people often have to trade curiosity for conformity and trade originality for obedience. And yet it's that curiosity and that originality that are so crucial right now, because the robots are doing the menial work, and we need an education system that's really ripe for the innovation era. And I think the more that we can move away from this sort of old-fashioned system of schooling, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I love that too, because it goes back to that education definition of becoming, right? So the always learning and curiosity and becoming, as opposed to the system mentality of it's holds you back and you're limited to only that certain concept or idea. So I love that.
What are some of the, I guess, maybe mistakes that a new unschooler may make as they begin that journey?
Well, I think some of it is just recognizing that this is a totally different way of thinking about education. So for a lot of families who may choose unschooling, it's coming from a conventional mindset and then recognizing that there are other ways to learn. So it's giving yourself some grace, I suppose, for, charting a new path. And then avoiding the temptation to replicate school at home or import kind of these conventional notions of schooling and impose that on children. And I think specifically in an unschooling environment, again, whether that's unschooling as a form of homeschooling, or it's in a self-directed microschool in a community, or the Sudbury style of schooling, which I talk about a lot in the book. It's making sure that we're allowing children really to drive their learning instead of them waiting around for us to tell them what they need to do. We're there to support and to facilitate and to connect, but we're not going to impose, kind of our expectations of education onto them.
So in your book, you talk about children choosing what they learn. What are some of the other benefits that you saw you see for a child choosing their own learning path?
Joy, right? I mean, I think that's a big piece, and something I've been thinking about a lot lately is I think that, again, for those of us who went through conventional public schooling, we may have learned to play the game well. We may have learned to memorize and regurgitate to the satisfaction of the teacher and the test. And we may have even liked it. We might have even said we liked school. But I think, to see now, especially as I've been traveling across the country, visiting different kinds of innovative education models, including unschooling models, as well as other approaches with these microschools, it's recognizing that there can truly be joy in learning, that there are places where children learn where they are not looking forward to the upcoming winter break because they are so excited about where and what they're learning in these environments. And I think it's recognizing for parents that that's possible, that your kids can be happy, that they can be joyful, and that there are these learning settings that enable that, and more coming every day.
I love that, Kerry, because we've seen that with kids, talking to other moms, and with our kids, even that joy, once you do look at other things and they get to choose kind of what they're learning. So I love that idea of joy. So, because that's truly and I think I look at my life, I don't know about you guys, but what do I most remember when I learned? It was the things I enjoyed, and took the time to want to learn and guided myself. So,
and even now too, right? Like when we're really excited about a topic, or we feel somehow motivated, even if it's going on YouTube because we have to fix a toilet or something, there's some personal motivation, and then we'll learn it, we'll do it. And I think that's another piece. I mean, you brought up YouTube earlier, Jon, is that it used to be that we went to school because that was where the knowledge was, that was where the teachers were and the books were. And now it's right at our fingertips, and we have access to so much more knowledge and information, so many tools, many of which are free. We can learn subjects and content from some of the best teachers in the whole world, right on our screens, and we can decide the teachers that we want. Some styles of learning we might prefer to others. And so there's a real democratization, I think, of information and knowledge that has come through technology and innovation, that makes this sort of self-directed approach to learning certainly work for us as adults. And this is how we continue to learn and discover, but can also work for our children.
Yeah. I love that.
That's awesome. Kerry, thank you so much for being on our podcast. We like to end with one kind of off the wall question that isn't about unschooling, but something we've become passionate about lately is history. And so we would like to know, who is someone you admire from history and why?
Well, I'll bring it back to unschooling. So I have a whole chapter on kind of the history of the philosophy of self-directed education and non-coercive learning. And one of the kind of historical figures that I admire is A.S. Neill, who founded the famed Summerhill School in England in 1921, and it continues to exist and flourish today over a century later. A.S. Neill created really what was the first sort of self-directed, non-coercive school that follows these unschooling principles. He then wrote a book called Summerhill School, A New View of Childhood in 1960, that ended up selling more than 2 million copies in its first decade in print, and inspired other educators and authors at that time, including John Holt, who I mentioned earlier, coined the term unschooling, and he also, A.S. Neill's work also inspired the founders of the Sudbury Valley School, that Sudbury model of schooling that I talk about in the book, where there's dozens of Sudbury model schools across the world that also follow these principles of self-directed learning. So he would probably be one of my historical heroes.
Awesome.
That's neat. I've got to look into him. So. So, Kerry, thank you so much. It's been a delight to talk with you. Where can our followers find you?
Oh, it's been so great to be with you both. Thanks again for having me. You can find me at the Foundation for Economic Education at fee.org/Kerry. There you'll get connected to my articles, link to my book, a link to my weekly email newsletter. You can also listen to my podcast, LiberatED Podcast, wherever you get podcasts, and follow me on Twitter at Kerry_EDU.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Kerry.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Diamond Education Podcast.
You can connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
At Diamond Education, DIMOND, or on our website, diamonded.com.